Hey everyone, Christoph here with ScaleYourCode.com, and today's guest is here to talk to us about cooking recipes for our servers. That's right, we're going to be talking about Chef, the chef used to completely automate server management. So whether you own 1 or 1,000 servers, Chef takes control of your infrastructure so you can focus on building your application and not worry about the time-consuming details of your servers. You know, I had a few viewers from Chris Fidal's interview a few weeks ago come to me because he talked about Chef versus Ansible, and some people just told me that Chef was a little bit too overwhelming at first sight, and so they went to Ansible instead. So I asked Nathen to come on the show here to give us more clarity on what Chef does and how to get started with it. Now, Nathen is part of the Chef team, and he also has his own Chef podcast called The Food Fight Show. And Nathen, it's a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Thanks. It's really great to be here.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm assuming you weren't born with knowledge of how to configure servers. So, how did you get started in such a vast world?
Oh, yeah, that's definitely the case. I was not born understanding how to configure servers.
Okay, good. I feel better now.
Yeah. No, it's all good. In fact, I'm not sure anyone was born with that as a skill.
I hope not.
But actually, the way that I learned was it was quite fun. Actually, I joined a startup to be a director of customer support, and then 3 days after I joined said startup, they fired all of the developers and hired in a new team to build out the application that we were building. And they told me that we were going live in 6 weeks, and I had that much time to become a sysadmin and build out a production infrastructure. So essentially, the way I learned to become a sysadmin and the way I learned to manage servers was I jumped into the deep end of a pool. I was way underwater, and in order to survive, I had to fight my way to the top.
So you literally had no experience before that, and they gave you 6 months to figure it out.
It was 6 weeks, and
6 weeks, sorry.
To say I had no experience would be a lie. I definitely was familiar with Linux, had run a bunch of applications, but I'd never sort of started from zero and built up a full infrastructure. I had done web development and some things like that in the past, right? So I was definitely familiar with managing servers, but I hadn't really done it as a job.
Right, and that's entirely a different story as well. I mean,
yep,
all kinds of new material you have to learn. So what kind of issues did you run into? Can you give us a few examples?
Yeah, sure. Like the first issue I ran into is I didn't know what the heck I was doing. And so I had to learn a lot. Luckily, I had some friends that were able to help me out. And so part of the best way to learn was actually to sit with someone else and kind of talk through what exactly we were trying to do. It was difficult, I felt, to know when we were done. Like exactly what are we trying to build? What are the full accomplishments that we want to make sure that we meet so that we know that we're done? I spent a lot of time just hacking and banging on the keyboard, if you will. And then I was very nervous every time I would enter a command into the keyboard because I wanted to be sure I could repeat that command in the future when I had to stand up another server, as an example. So the way I got over those nerves were I would save any command that I typed into a wiki so that I could repeat those commands later. The problem with doing that, though, I found, I didn't find this out right away. It took me a little bit to find this out. As it turns out, when you hit save on a wiki, that wiki pretty much becomes a lie. Because what would happen is I would then go back and modify the server just a little bit, make a little tweak here, a little tweak there. And then when I went to stand up a new server, I'd go back to the wiki and I'd try to run all those instructions, and maybe they would work, but definitely the server wasn't in the end state that I wanted it to be in because I hadn't kept my documentation up to date. And so that was really, really painful.
Yeah, I can see that being pretty painful. Also interesting how they fired the entire development team and hired a new one to work on the product. Wonder how that worked out, but
yeah, I mean we did launch successfully to
good.
Great fanfare a couple of weeks later, which was a lot of fun. So yeah, it was a really interesting time. I wish now that I knew, I wish I knew now. I wish back then I knew what I know now,
Right.
because I certainly would have done all of that stuff with something like Chef instead of blindly just banging on a keyboard and hoping for the best.
Yeah, don't we all? So after that experience, did you go directly to Chef or Opscode as it used to be called?
No, so from there I went to another organization where I was running their web operations. So we had pretty large scale infrastructure where we were running in a combination of physical data centers and in the cloud.
Okay.
And we were using automation frameworks to basically set up the entire configuration of our infrastructure. And when I left there, we were using Chef. We'd been using Chef for about 2 years. And that's when I joined the company called Chef,
Okay.
which at the time was a company called Opscode, but we've since changed our name to Chef.
Okay. Any particular reason why you changed that name, or?
Yeah, I'll tell you what. So, Christoph, you and I met at a conference,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, we met at POSCON. So I go to a lot of conferences. I would go to conferences and people would ask me where I work, and I would mention that I worked at Opscode. And they would say, "Oh, cool, what does Opscode do? I've never heard of them." And I would tell them, "Oh, well, we're the company that's behind the open source framework called Chef." "Oh my God, I love Chef.
Yeah.
What's the name of that company you work at again?" So after enough of those interactions, it just became obvious that, to help out our company, to help the framework and our community grow, the best thing we could do was actually change the name of our company to Chef.
That makes a lot of sense. And actually, while doing research for this interview, I still landed on resources that had the name Opscode or something to do with Opscode. How long ago did you change that name?
Yeah, it's been just about a year and a half since we changed the name. So, as it turns out, when you put something on the internet, it kind of lives forever. So, yes, there will forever, I would imagine, be references to this company called Opscode, this mysterious company called Opscode.
Right. I was going to say that's a prime example of how difficult it is to actually change your name once you're established in the market like that. So, very good example of that. So, what do you actually do at Chef right now? Since I know you go to a lot of conferences, like you just said, what's your job?
Yeah, so I'm a community director at Chef, which means a couple of different things. One of the things I do is I go out to a lot of conferences and to a lot of different places to help people learn about Chef, get excited about Chef, and really to become successful with Chef. In addition to that, as I mentioned, Chef is an open source framework. So I actually have, or I work with a team of engineers where our job is to make sure that it's easy for folks outside of the company to contribute back to Chef. So we work with open source contributors to make sure that it's easy for them to submit pull requests into our framework, to get those pull requests merged in, and so forth. I also help manage what's called the supermarket. It's at supermarket.chef.io. Our supermarket is a place where you can share cookbooks with others within the Chef community. So that's part of what I do as well. And then from time to time, I make some pretty zany videos that I'm sure you can, maybe you can add some links to the notes or whatever from this episode.
I'm definitely going to link up to some of those videos because they're hilarious. You did a fantastic job with them. I mean, those.
Thanks. I hope they're informative also.
They are, yeah.
There's a video that describes what DevOps is or talks about a good definition of DevOps. And then there's another one where we're talking about continuous delivery.
Well, and you do such a good job at integrating some of the vocabulary, like I tried to do in the beginning of the intro with recipes and cookbook and kitchen and all that, yeah, with the eggs. And anyway, I won't go into too much detail. I'll link up the videos. People can see it for themselves. Talking about it won't do it justice.
Yeah.
So, and I was going to say as well that honestly, you did a fantastic job of spreading the word for Chef. When I went to POSCON, as you mentioned earlier, your presentation really inspired me to do this talk. And as I mentioned in the intro, there was also a lot of debate that I saw online and some of my viewers talked to me about between Ansible, Chef, and Puppet, and so on, from both a user friendliness and scalability point of view. And so before we move on to the meat of the interview, I'd like to address some of these points just for people who have these questions before moving forward. And so for a viewer who is currently using something like Ansible or Puppet, or even just debating about the best solution, why and when do you think Chef is the right solution?
Sure. So I would say this to start. First, I get asked this question a lot. Should I use Ansible, or should I use Chef, or should I use Puppet, or should I use SaltStack, or one of these other frameworks? My answer to that question is always this, Chris. It's always yes. You should absolutely use one of those frameworks. The thing that you should stop doing is banging on the keyboard, writing your own shell scripts to configure your applications and configure your infrastructure. You should definitely use one of the frameworks. That said, if you're currently using one of the frameworks and it's working for you, you're not feeling any pain from that framework, you should keep using that framework.
Hmm.
That's a good one for you to use. It's good for your team. I think the reasons why you might choose Chef, Chef really is a full or offers a full set of tools that will actually enable a full DevOps workflow. It starts with the basis or the basics of configuration management. So how do I configure the machines within my infrastructure? But Chef includes other things like provisioning your servers. How do I provision new servers in the cloud in my data center? Chef includes a lot of tools around test driving your infrastructure code. Frankly, it's code. You should treat it just like your application code. You should be able to write automated tests for it. And with Chef, we have really powerful tools within the framework and within the ecosystem that allow you to test drive your code before you run it on your production systems. We also kind of take testing to the next level. If you think about testing, testing is really about making sure that the code that you run in production is going to work successfully. Well, if you take that to the next step, what about things like auditing that your infrastructure is behaving the way that you like? Chef has a tool called Analytics that you can utilize, and then capabilities within the framework that allow you to assert specific things are happening on your running systems.
Okay.
This is really great when you get into sort of an audit and compliance mode within your organization and need to ensure that things are working exactly as the auditors require or exactly as your requirements specify. And then finally, there's also things around continuous delivery. We recently launched a product as part of our framework called Delivery that really is all about providing you both visibility into your continuous delivery pipeline, and it gives you a defined pipeline, a defined workflow for how you get code from your developer's workstation all the way through to your production environment. And that code can be your infrastructure code, or it can be your application code. It doesn't really matter. What Delivery does is provide a single pipeline for all of your code and provides visibility across that pipeline.
I see. And another point that people have stressed on is that it's a bit overwhelming to begin with, and there's this sort of steep learning curve that you have to overcome.
Sure.
Why do you think that is? What are some of the roadblocks that you see people struggling with the most?
So here's the thing that I like to say about that. Complex systems and managing and modeling complex systems is, in fact, complex. Like the framework is very, very powerful. The thing that I see with challenges is, it's kind of just like learning any other language or learning any other framework or any other tool. You don't want to start by boiling the ocean, if you will. If your goal is initially to boil the ocean, you're never going to get that done. What you want to do is start with something that you understand really well and work towards automating that. And sort of take a stepwise approach, learn the basics. Don't try to learn everything about Chef at once. Learn something to complete a specific task that you have in mind. Once you've completed that, you can start layering in other opportunities, other tooling within the ecosystem, and other ways that you want to automate your infrastructure. So I think that there is a learning curve. Absolutely. You're basically learning a new language. If you sat down to write Rails for the first time, you probably started with a hello world.
Yeah.
Or any other language, you probably started with a hello world. I recommend starting with a hello world with Chef also.
That makes a lot of sense. And speaking of Rails, Chef uses a lot of Ruby. So do you think that's another roadblock? If I don't know any Ruby, do you think that's going to hold me back? Or is it, yeah, what do you think about that?
Sure. So personally, I think that if you don't know any Ruby, you can be scared away from Chef if people tell you what you have to learn is Ruby to learn Chef. And I would say that that's absolutely not true. I would say that if you want to learn Chef, you should probably have some programming skills. You should probably know how to, as an example, do some control flow, like an if statement, maybe an iteration, a for loop. And really, it doesn't matter which language you know this in. The Ruby that you're going to be exposed to as you get started with Chef it's merely syntax. You're going to be writing Chef. It doesn't look any different than normal Ruby. It doesn't feel much different than, say, writing PHP or Python.
Yeah, I agree. From the playing around I did with Chef, again, for this interview, I did not find Ruby to be a major roadblock. I mean, it's quite simple. It's almost like writing English, frankly.
Right.
So it's not that bad.
Yeah, but the thing to keep in mind is that getting started is super easy, and Ruby shouldn't scare you
Yeah.
away. But when you do reach that point in complexity within your infrastructure and you need additional tools within your infrastructure automation, you've got the full Ruby ecosystem at your fingertips within
Hmm.
Chef. And so that makes it very, very powerful. It makes it easy to get started with, absolutely, and then absolutely powerful when it gets to automating the entirety of your infrastructure, and when you get into those complex situations.
That makes a lot of sense. And what would you say are some resources to overcome this learning curve? Taking the first steps. I know there's
Yep.
the learnchef.io. That's very helpful. Are there any other ones that help as well?
Yeah, I would say that LearnChef.io is absolutely the place to start. Over time, we continually are evolving the way that we introduce Chef to people. We offer classes in a classroom, we offer online classes, and then we offer self-directed stuff here on LearnChef.io. And really, we're constantly evolving based on the feedback that we see and how successful we see our students being with the platform. We're constantly evolving exactly how we introduce you to this. And so you'll always find the best practices or the most up-to-date introductions to Chef on learnchef.com or at learn.chef.io. Yeah, so I would absolutely start there. Of course, there's also the docs site at docs.chef.io. But frankly, documentation is meant to be a reference guide.
Hmm.
And when you want to sit down to learn, you don't necessarily start, say, with an encyclopedia and just start reading the encyclopedia from beginning to
Right,
end.
right.
And it can sometimes feel like that's what you're trying to do if you go right to the documentation. It's definitely there as your reference, as you're learning. But the thing that I would do, the thing that I always recommend to folks is first start with Learn Chef. And then second, start with a real problem that you have. Start playing around with Chef. The best way for you to use Chef is to, I'm sorry, the best way for you to learn Chef is to use Chef.
Hmm. I think that holds true for anything, PHP, Ruby, whatever you want, any building of any programming or anything like that. You have to practice to get good at it. So do
That's
you think
absolutely.
that Chef is something that's only useful if you're going for larger scale, like multiple machines, or should it also be used if you just have one server or two servers or three servers? When do you think it becomes useful like that?
Yep. So I think that Chef, or frankly any of these other frameworks, become useful the minute you have a second computer, or the minute you want to make sure that your first computer you're going to be able to rebuild that. And it doesn't really matter if that computer is a server or if it's your laptop. Chef can be used to manage either of those. And really, the benefit of Chef is that you're capturing the desired configuration for your infrastructure in code.
And what kind of infrastructures can Chef really manage? Is it just web servers and databases and things like that, or are there other kinds of infrastructures that Chef can manage?
Sure. Chef can pretty much manage any bit of your infrastructure, any type of infrastructure that you have. As an example, there are many people that work with me at Chef that use Chef to configure their local laptops. They run it on their Mac
Huh.
to keep it up to date, keep the applications that they want and the configuration settings that they want up to date. You can use Chef in large-scale applications, whether they're Linux-based operating systems or Windows-based operating systems. It doesn't matter. Chef works really well with both of those.
Hmm.
You can also use Chef for things that are within your infrastructure, but aren't really servers per se. For example, you may be using a load balancer, like a hardware-based load balancer, maybe something from F5 as an example.
Okay.
You could use Chef to manage your F5 load balancer through the cookbooks that are available within the community. You may also use Chef on your networking gear, like your switches,
Hmm.
and depending on how those depending on the brand of switch and the capabilities of that switch, Chef may run directly on there, or you may manipulate that through other recipes that run on other hosts using Chef.
Okay, and I want to walk through in a little bit through a scenario where we have a web server and a database just to show how to get started with it. But before we do that, I think it's important to walk through a few definitions of Chef, like the cookbook and the recipe, so people don't just shake their heads when we say the word and have no idea what we're talking about. So let's start
Sure.
with, can you give us or help us picture the different layers in Chef, like the Chef server, the cookbooks, and recipes. Can you walk through a few of those?
Yeah, and I think probably the best way to do that is if I actually do some screen sharing and just show you some code. How
Great.
does that sound?
Yeah, sounds great.
All right, let's see here.
All right, there we
Okay,
go. Yep, I see
can
it.
you see my you can see my terminal window here?
Yes.
Okay. So on this particular machine where I'm logged in, I'm just I'm in my home directory. This machine happens to be well, it doesn't really matter what it is. It's a machine that has the Chef development kit
Okay.
installed on it. And so let's start off with sorry, which thing did you ask me to define first? I want to start off kind of where you asked me to.
Let's talk about the different layers and how they all piece together, like the Chef
Sure.
server and all that.
Okay, great. So if we think about Chef, let's I guess we can start at sort of a little bit of a higher level. Um, let's see. Let me show you. Can you see this diagram here from the
Yes.
docs page? Okay, great. So this is on docs.chef.io/chef_overview.html. There's a nice diagram here that kind of shows you all the pieces and parts of Chef. Now, at first glance, this diagram can be super overwhelming. So let me just kind of walk through all the different pieces here. So when it comes to Chef, you're going to your end goal is to manage nodes within your infrastructure. So if we look over here on the right, hopefully you can see my cursor. I'm kind of
Yes.
hovering over various pieces here. So the nodes are the bits of your infrastructure where your applications are running. These are the things that Chef is going to manage for you. These can be physical nodes, virtual nodes, cloud instances, whatever. And each one of these will run an application called the Chef client. Now, the Chef client's job is to keep this piece of your infrastructure in line with its desired state. And the Chef client will know what is the desired state for a particular node by asking the Chef server. So over here on the left, sort of in the middle, is the Chef server itself. So the Chef server has things on it that describe what the desired state of your nodes should be. The things that describe what the desired state are include things like cookbooks, data bags, a run list, and so forth. So the way that it works is if we're on this node here, when the Chef client executes, it will ask the Chef server, what is my run list? And really the run list is a subset of your policies or a subset of your recipes.
Okay.
And that says basically, hey, you should be a web server. And so the appropriate cookbooks will be downloaded from the Chef server to this client. And then this Chef client will look at that desired state. Oh, this should be a web server that's running Apache. Is Apache currently installed on this machine, and is it running? If not, I'm going to change the state of this machine such
Okay.
that is true. And if it is, then I won't do anything, except maybe 30 minutes later I'm going to wake up and check again to make sure that it stays in line with that desired configuration.
Okay, great.
So each one of these nodes could be a different type of thing. So maybe this one is a web server, maybe this one is a database server, maybe this one is something that's monitoring all of those other servers. So the things that describe the desired state really are recipes. And recipes may pull data from things like databags or from a search or what have you. But you're going to write those recipes on your local workstation. So down here at the bottom of this diagram, we have the local workstation. And when it comes to writing recipes, what we really encourage is that you test your recipes as you're writing them. So Chef includes a number of tools such as Test Kitchen and Chef Spec that allow you to write your recipes following a test-driven workflow. So the test-driven workflow really says you should write your tests first, and then after writing your tests and watching those tests fail, then you should write just enough code to make them pass, watch the test pass, and then write your next test.
Okay.
And you sort of get into this workflow. This way, when you come back later to change your code, you have a test framework already set up for you. Writing your test first also helps you know when you're done. I know that I had to write, my requirements stated this. I captured those requirements in my tests. I can now execute those tests and see that things are working. Of course, you are writing code, so you're going to store that code in a version control system. So we have a little Chef repo down here. Typically, that's going to be a Git a Git repository that you're going to store that code in.
Okay.
You don't necessarily have to write your own cookbooks. You could pull cookbooks off of the Chef Supermarket. That's the place I mentioned earlier where you can share cookbooks with others within the community. Although I will tell you that the best way to get started with Chef is to kind of ignore the supermarket. You should first start by writing your own cookbooks. And this is, the same advice I would give you as you're learning any framework. Don't start just by plugging a bunch of pieces together. That might feel really quick and easy to help you get started, but the minute you need to change the way one of those things works, you don't necessarily really understand how the code works underneath. And so that's where you run into challenges. So I think it's always best to, as you're learning Chef, to start with nothing, write your own cookbook, write your own recipe first. So that you can learn how the system works, how it behaves. And then back at the top of this diagram, we have Chef Analytics, which is that thing that I was talking about that can help sort of ensure that your nodes are compliant. You can run things as part of your Chef client run like audit tests or audit checks, and they could fire off rules and so forth with analytics, which maybe will notify you, like, for example, let's say you're running an application server that must be PCI compliant. If it falls outside of compliance, you might kick off an alert or a notification to your team that, hey, I just moved outside of the bounds of compliance and I need to be addressed.
And by the way, the Chef server can either be hosted by Chef itself, or you can have it in your own infrastructure as an instance in your infrastructure. And I believe the Chef server, for the free tier anyway, you can have up to 5 nodes. Is that right?
Yeah. So the way that it works is the Chef server itself, and the basic functionality that comes with the Chef server is fully open source.
Okay.
So you can deploy that in a number of different ways. You can deploy it in your own data center or within your own cloud, and there again, it's open source, so it's free to use. You can manage as many nodes as you like with that Chef server.
I see. Okay.
We also have a hosted version of Chef. So if you don't want to manage your own Chef server, you can use hosted Chef. And actually, as you're starting to learn Chef, I definitely recommend hosted Chef as the best way to get started. Because when it comes to learning Chef, what you don't necessarily care about initially is how to stand up a Chef server. What you care about is the nodes within your infrastructure. How do I write the appropriate cookbooks for those nodes? Well, skip setting up a Chef server, just use hosted Chef to start. And as you mentioned, hosted Chef is free for up to 5 nodes. So you can connect 5 nodes to your hosted Chef server and you can use that for free. Now, there are other things, for example, Chef Analytics, that are premium features that you can install on top of your Chef server or alongside your Chef server. Those premium features are free to use for up to 25 nodes, but usually those premium features require that you're running your own Chef server or at least running the premium features internal on your own data center or within your own cloud. After 25 nodes, then cost does come into the picture, and of course it just depends on which features you're using, but there are subscription plans that you can set up with Chef, the company, that will allow you to use those premium features.
And then for the Chef repo, that's your local workstation, and you install that by downloading the Chef DK?
That's right. If you want to get started with Chef, the first thing that you would do is install the Chef Development Kit or the Chef DK. And you can then use the Chef Development Kit to create cookbooks on your own.
All right, so let's move into the scenario now that we have a really good overview of how everything works. And let's pretend that we're going to just set up a web server and a MySQL database. And the first step that you said is just get the hosted Chef server and then get the Chef DK for your local workstation and get all that set up with the different keys and stuff like that. Then what would be the next step?
Yeah, so let's just start with this machine here. I have Chef DK already installed, so I have a Chef command line tool here, and I can do Chef version. If I could spell properly, it will work. And we'll see here that we have the Chef Development Kit. It's at version 0.5.0, and in addition to or as part of the Chef Development Kit, we have a number of other tools that are installed as part of the development kit. So it's just showing me the versions for each one of those. Now, my shell here shows me that I'm on a master branch. So in fact, this is already set up as a Git repository. If I do Git status, we'll see that there's Really, it's a clean
Mhm.
repository. And what I'll do is I'll push all of this code to a public repository so that viewers can, just go and download that repository and see
Awesome.
all the code that we write today.
Great.
So we want to start by creating a repo for all of our chef code.
And just to
And I can,
clarify, this is the local workstation, right?
yep.
Okay.
So my host name here is this. It's
Okay.
nathanharvey.local. So
All right.
I'm on my local Mac right now. Of course, this would work on Mac or Windows or any flavor of Linux that
Right.
you like or whatever. But my local development environment happens to be a Mac. So I'm going to start by creating a repository for all of my chef code. So I'm going to use the chef tool. It has a bunch of generators. So I'm going to generate a repo. And I'm just going to call that repo, just like we did in the diagram, chef-repo.
All right.
Of course, the name of the repo is relatively insignificant. It should mean something to you, but Chef doesn't care what you call that repo. And we saw a bunch of stuff just run by there, but the net result is we now have this new directory called the Chef repo. And I can look at what's within this directory. We can see that there's a cookbooks directory, a directory for data bags, for environments and roles. These are all just different things that you can use to sort of specify the desired state of your environment. But let's sort of walk through your scenario. And actually, just for the sake of time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to simplify your desired scenario a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
We're going to start with a hello world.
Okay.
We won't get to a database. I think we'll run out of time before we get there. But what I'd like to do is kind of walk through the test-driven workflow to get us all the way through to a hello world. Does that sound okay to you?
That sounds great. Yeah.
All right. Awesome. So the first thing, let's say our hello world is going to be this. Here's our hello world scenario. I want a web server that shows me hello world when I pull up the web page. The way that I'm going to do that is the first thing I'm going to do is create a cookbook. So I'm in my Chef repo. I'm going to use Chef again to generate a cookbook. And the cookbook that I'm going to create will be for my web server. So I can call it whatever I like. Again, the name is kind of arbitrary. It's up to me. It should be something that means something to me. How about I just call it web server? So Chef generate cookbook web server. Okay, so what this did actually was something that I didn't mean for it to do. What I meant to run was a command like this. I meant to put that into the cookbooks directory. Right. So Chef generate cookbooks web server. You see what it did instead was put it directly within my Chef repo directory. Instead of rerunning that, I'm just going to move it. So I'm going to move web server into the cookbooks directory. Okay, so now if I go into cookbooks web server and I can look at the files that were created here, we'll see that a default recipe was created. And then some test folders and some tests were actually created as well. So I mentioned that the thing we should do is write our tests first. In order to write our tests first, one of the things that we'll want sort of to run our tests is a place where we can actually see our code working and a place where we can run our tests. I'm going to start with my integration tests because the integration tests really are going to be the tests that tell us that we're done with this thing. But here's a little problem that we have. In order to run my integration tests, I actually need to spin up an environment where I can apply this recipe, where I can apply this desired configuration.
All right.
Before I can do that, I have to have that environment somewhere. My production systems aren't going to be Mac, so I shouldn't just test this locally on my Mac. I should test it in a real production environment. Chris, do you prefer Ubuntu or CentOS when it comes to Linux? You prefer Ubuntu. Yes. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm actually just going to open up this entire directory in Atom, my text editor. And let's just get this going here and make sure that you can see it. So you can see this okay, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So when it comes to spinning up your an environment, one of the things that we can do is we can use a tool called Test Kitchen. I want to walk you through Test Kitchen really quickly here. Test Kitchen allows me to spin up virtual machines where I can then execute my recipes. So one of the ways that you can use Test Kitchen is with Vagrant. I'm pretty sure you've mentioned Vagrant on an episode or two before.
Yes. Yeah.
You could also, if you don't know what Vagrant is or don't want to use Vagrant, you could use something like EC2 or DigitalOcean to spin up these virtual machines. I'm going to stick with Vagrant for today. Next, you have your provisioner. So this is what application will be used to provision the node once you spin it up. And we're going to just leave that at chef 0, which is the default. Platforms, for the sake of time, we're only going to test on one platform. So I'm just going to comment out this CentOS one because you said you prefer Ubuntu. So that's great.
Okay.
And then finally, we have these suites. Well, let's just switch back and forth here and look a little bit further at exactly what does this kitchen YAML get for me. And actually, before I switch back to my terminal, I'm going to uncomment that just for a second. So one of the things I can do, I'm within my cookbook, I can run a kitchen list. And what this will do is show me that with the default kitchen YAML, I'm going to create an Ubuntu VM and a CentOS VM. And I'm going to run the default recipe in each one of them. I'm going to create those VMs using Vagrant. But for the sake of time, we're going to skip the CentOS one. So I'm just going to comment that out. And then I'm going to come back here and run kitchen list. And what you'll see here is now it only is showing me the Ubuntu one. And so if I wanted to, I could add as many platforms as I like here. The beauty of this is I can now just run this command, kitchen create. And what it's going to do is actually launch a virtual machine for me. And in this case, it's going to be the Ubuntu box. So it's going to launch an Ubuntu VM for me. And then I'll have that locally on my machine. It will launch each one of the kitchens that I have listed in my kitchen.yaml. So with one command, I could launch as many virtual machines as are required to test out this cookbook.
That's really cool.
All right, while this is running, I'm just going to let this run in the background. Let's go write our first integration test. So I'm back in my cookbook here and in my code editor. Down here I have my tests folder in integration default, and then I'm in a folder called server spec. So server spec is actually a test framework that lives or sits on top of RSpec. RSpec is a testing framework within Ruby, and you can see that the generator gave me a nice comment. Here I can go and find out about the server spec resources that you can write tests for. So this is our web server default. What did we say we were going to do? How do we know we're done, Chris? What did we say we were going to do?
Just a hello world that gives you a page that says hello world.
Right. So the web server, so we're going to describe our web server, and let's just say it should, or it displays the homepage. If our server does this, we're done, right?
Okay.
So let's write this test. Of course, we have a little skip test here. We don't want to skip this test. What we're going to do instead is we write this test. What we do in server spec is we specify expectations. So I expect some resource type, and server spec has a bunch of resource types. Chris, if you were logging into a machine, how might you check if the homepage was being displayed?
Just do a curl or something like that?
Yeah, a curl sounds good. That's great. So server spec has a resource type called a command. So I'm going to expect a particular command, and that command in this case is going to be curl http localhost. And I expect that, let's check the exit status. So I'm going to check the exit status of that command, and I expect it to equal 0.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Does this make sense to you?
It does, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
This is Ruby. Are you scared?
No.
All right.
Like awesome. I said, it looks like English to me.
Yeah. So our web server default, it should display the homepage. So I expect the command curl http localhost to have an exit status equal to 0.
So would you say that this is a good kind of test where you don't have to separate it, like you don't have to check, oh, the server is actually running, and then I'm going to check if the localhost page is receiving a status or something like that? Or would you only break it down if you're not receiving a status okay for localhost?
Yeah, so I would start here, and then I would layer in additional tests. Yeah. So let's just walk through that. So my kitchen was created. I just cleared my buffer, so you can't see that. Mm-hmm. But if I do a kitchen list back here, we'll see that sure enough, this kitchen was created. Mm-hmm. Now, the next thing I need to do is I need to put my recipe my cookbook, basically my web server cookbook, into that server, into that virtual machine, and apply it. And the way that I do that is through a command called kitchen converge. And what kitchen converge is going to do, I'll walk you through it as it starts here at least. It's going to look locally at my cookbooks and say, oh, there's a cookbook called web server. I need to put this web server cookbook into the virtual machine. I also need to run the Chef client, or Chef 0, which was our provisioner.
Okay.
And Chef 0, honestly, is just, it's a version of the Chef client that does not require a Chef server in place. So the first thing that is going to happen is the Chef client itself is going to be installed on my virtual machine. So it's just installed Chef, and then it executed my resource, or it executed my recipe. It ran the web server cookbook. And we can see here that the Chef client finished and 0 of 0 resources were updated. This makes sense because I haven't written anything into my recipe. So let's verify. Let's actually run our test. The way that we run our test is we run kitchen verify. Kitchen verify is going to take our server spec test that we just wrote and put it onto the virtual machine. Now, the server spec is using our test is using server spec. So the first thing it will actually do is install the server spec gem for us onto that virtual machine and then execute our test.
Okay.
And we can see here that, we have all kinds of problems here actually. So failure, expect command curl to exit with a 0. Curl was not actually found on that host.
Oh, okay.
So that's a problem. We know that we can't finish, we can't pass this test yet. Let's try this. Let's try kitchen login. What kitchen login will do is actually take us into that machine. Okay. And you can see here that I'm the Vagrant user on the default Ubuntu. Let's see if wget is installed here. Wget is. Curl is not. So what if I were to change my thing so that it did a wget localhost?
So here you have the choice where you can either change to something you already have, or you could go into a recipe and add install curl, right?
Absolutely. I could absolutely install curl. But, at the end of the day, I don't really need curl installed on my web server.
Right.
What I need is a way to test that. And I see that localhost is here. And if I tried a wget, and then I echo the return status, you'll see that the return status by default, because it's failing to connect, is 4. So let's just change our test. I'm going to come back here and change this from curl to wget. And then I'm going to rerun my kitchen verify. And as I run a kitchen verify, I expect this to fail again, but I expect a different failure this time.
Right, okay.
And in fact, I did. I expected the command to have an exit status of 0, but what I actually got was 4. So here's our problem. We haven't met our requirements. So we want to write code that will change the recipe such that this test will pass. Now, Chris, what would you do to get Apache working here?
Inside of the... Well, first of all, you'd have to have some kind of cookbook that gets Apache up and running.
Right. So we might need to install Apache, right?
Right.
So one of the things that we could do is we could have another test here that says something like this. It installs Apache.
And are these tests going to run in order from top to bottom?
Yes, they will run in order from top to bottom. So I could say I inspect the package Apache2 to be installed. This is another test that I'm running. And if I come back after running that and I do a kitchen verify, we're going to see that, in fact, now I have 2 failing tests. So I didn't make things any better. All I've done is put more assertions in tests here. The problem, there is a small problem here, though. When it comes to an integration test, do we really care if it's Apache or Nginx that's serving up the homepage? Our requirement is just that we have the homepage, right?
Right.
So I don't really like this as an integration test because like I said, it doesn't matter if it's Apache or if it's Nginx,
Yeah.
or if we were to write this on CentOS, the package would be HTTPD. And I don't really care about those details in my integration tests. So what I'd like to do instead is move this test to a unit test. And so under spec, unit, recipes, default spec, I have another set of tests here that are using a tool called chefspec. So chefspec is a unit testing framework that's also built on top of RSpec. And it's going to work in a very similar way to what we saw with server spec. So instead of having this test here, I'm actually going to remove this test where it installs the package, and I'm going to place it over here. But I need to change this syntax a little bit. So if I were writing server spec, it would look like this. But since this is now chef spec, what I expect here is I expect the chef run. And so this thing is the chef run.
Okay.
What we're doing is saying that I want to, when I execute chef, I expect things to happen. So what I expect is that the chef run will install a package named Apache 2.
Oh, okay.
And so now I can actually run this unit test. I can run that by running rspec on my spec directory. And it's going to run my unit test here, and it's going to run a couple of tests. Let's just look at the tests while they run in the background. It's going to run a test that says that this converges successfully, so the chef run should not raise an error, and it should install the package named Apache 2.
Right. Okay.
So let's go back and look at this. We have 2 examples and 1 failure. So the chef run didn't raise an error, but the package Apache 2 was not installed. Now we have good failing tests. Let's change our recipe so that this test will actually pass. So what I'm going to do next, and finally, we're going to write some recipe code.
Yes.
We've been waiting for the whole time, right? Here's how recipe code works in Chef. You have a number of resources that you can define. One type of resource is a package. And we're going to call this package Apache 2. And this is the type of resource is a package. We give it a name. The name is usually it's usually meaningful. So in the case of a package, it's the name of our package. And then we can specify some other attributes. Now I'm going to write some Ruby here, Chris. Don't get scared. I'm going to write in the word do and the word end. And so that just defines the beginning and the end of my resource definition.
Okay.
So it basically, between this do and this end, we can specify some other attributes.
Gotcha.
One attribute that we might specify is the action for this particular resource. And the action for this resource is install. And what install means is that Chef will test the current running system. Is the package Apache 2 installed? If it's not, it will install it. If it is, then it's already met this desired state.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
So now that I've saved that, let's come back here and rerun my unit tests. Let's see if those work.
And that's the beauty of it. It installs it. You just say, I want this installed. I want this in a certain state. And Chef does whatever it takes to get it in that state.
That's exactly right. And so I've just run my unit test, and we see now both tests are passing. So what if I ran my my integration test? So let's try this on a real virtual machine. So I'm going to run a kitchen converge again. And what that's going to do is take my newly updated recipe, put it onto that virtual machine, and execute my tests.
And that's what Converge does?
That's what Converge does.
Okay.
Yeah, and this failed. So what's going on here? You can see that it ran apt-get, and it tried to install Apache 2, but the error it actually is giving me is a pretty good error. What it's telling me is that you might need to run apt-get update. And so this is a thing where just my apt cache is out of it's not warmed up cache, right? Or it's fallen behind. So we can fix that very quickly. I'm going to cheat though. I'll tell you what I'm doing as I cheat. So I happen to know that there's a cookbook on the supermarket that's called the apt cookbook. So I'm going to build a new dependency on my web server cookbook. It depends on the apt cookbook. Now, I might need to download that, but there's actually a tool in the background called Bookshelf that's going to download that for me and put it onto my machine.
Okay.
But before I install this package, I need to include a recipe from that other cookbook.
So apt is the apt is the cookbook, and you're
Yep.
calling the default recipe.
That's exactly
Okay.
right, Chris. And what the default recipe will do, as it turns out, is it will refresh the cache for me. So I'm going to try running a kitchen converge again. And we'll see here that it's using Bookshelf to resolve my dependencies. So it's going to see that I have two dependencies, the web server cookbook and the apt cookbook. And so it's going to first grab the apt cookbook, and then it's going to run my default recipe for apt, which is doing a bunch of things here, you can see. And then when that's done, it's going to update my package Apache 2. And so sure enough, it tells me that 6 of 7 resources were updated. So now I'm ready to run my kitchen verify. And let's just see, are we seeing our homepage now? And so this is going to put those up there, and sure enough, it displays our homepage. Of course, I left on the it installs Apache package. So we see that 2 tests are now passing. And of course, if I were to kitchen login, I could run my wget, or I should spell the full name of the host, local host, and then I can cat index1, index.html1, and sure enough, you see the standard homepage that you expect to see when you install Apache.
Right, okay.
So the default homepage, right? So Chris, I think we're running low on time.
Okay.
But I think we've also just walked through kind of a test-driven workflow that will show you how you can get started with Chef and write some tests, watch those tests pass, write the right code to make those tests. Watch the test fail, write the code to make those tests pass, and then move on from there. So what you would do from here is you would then go and you would take your cookbook, you would publish it up to a Chef server, and then you could do something like launch a node off on EC2 and have that cookbook be applied to that node on EC2 or in your data center or on DigitalOcean, wherever you like.
Right.
And that's kind of the workflow with Chef.
Okay, and I would say from here also, and let me know what you think about this, but a good way to change, like we looked at cookbooks and how you can install something and how it takes care of installing everything for you. And then if you want to go ahead and change more of those default settings from Apache or Nginx or whatever, then you can just keep getting more, like changing the cookbook recipes, like adding more recipes and things like that, adding more configurations, and then using templates. Yeah, I was just about to talk about templates, where you can just change the default index.html and that kind of thing. Would you say that's a fair place to start?
Yeah,
with?
that's exactly right. So I could do something like this, where I say I have a new template, and it's going to have a source of index.html.erb, and I want it to have a particular mode or permissions on that file. And then, I don't know, I could have like the owner and the group and all of that specified. And then what I would do from here is I would actually come back over here, and I could do so I'm in my web server cookbook. I could use Chef to generate a template. And I want to put it in this particular cookbook. And the name I want to give it is index.html. And then while that runs, we can come back over here and we'll see I have this new templates directory. And then within that is index.html. And I could say, hello, Chris. And so now, if I were to rerun my kitchen converge, while that's running, I can also say, actually, I'm just going to leave that alone. So that failed. Oh, you know why? Because I used the wrong path here. So it's nice. We can see that failing very quickly before I get into production.
Yeah.
I guess I'm used to running on CentOS. This is the proper place for it on
Gotcha.
Ubuntu, right? So let's try this Kitchen Converge again. There we go. And so we can see here that it, from our output, it removed the default homepage and it put in place the Hello Chris page.
Yeah, I think this is a really good way to get started with this. And I'll also make sure to add more links and perhaps run through a few videos where we show how to extend more of this functionality. So I think this is a really good place to start. Do you have anything else you think you should add, or?
Absolutely. I would just add this, Chris. If you find this interesting, let's do another episode. If your viewers are interested in that, we can basically pick up from here at some point in the future. And also for everyone that's watching, if you're interested in getting started with Chef, remember, start at learn.chef.io. We'll give you some great examples of how to get started. Yeah.
That sounds great to me, Nathan. I really appreciate your time. If people want to get in touch with you or get in touch with people on the Chef team, how would you recommend they do that?
Yeah, the best way to reach me is through Twitter. On Twitter, I'm at Nathen Harvey, but my dad misspelled my first name. So it's at NathenHarvey. That's one way to contact me. The other way is you can just hit me on email. I'm nharvey@chef.io.
Every time I typed in your name in the text editor, it kept trying to autocorrect it.
Of course. Yep.
Thank you, Nathan, and thanks everybody for watching. Make sure you leave comments and let us know if you thought this would be or this was very helpful. And as Nathan said, hopefully we can get it back on the show and do more of this. So thank you all and have a fantastic day.